Hello, I'm Greg McWilliam with Vox Media, and I'm a contributor to GraphQL Tools, a friend of the Guild, and came in here today to go and talk about the 2021 reintroduction of GraphQL Tools Schema Stitching. So what we're going to be talking about here today is you can't really discuss schema stitching without understanding what is a distributed service graph. So a distributed service graph is when we go and we have a client trying to go and make a request for data, and that data is held by numerous subservices, microservices, or just schema partials someplace. We need to have one surface area that the request can come into, and then that one central gateway would be able to go and delegate down to smaller individual subschemas below it. So that's kind of the overarching view of what a distributed service graph is. And that might be a little bit hard to visualize. So if we go and we think of it more just in terms of looking at a plain GraphQL query, you can see we've got a very innocent looking query here for storefronts. It's going to fetch some products on a storefront, and then a product has manufacturers. If we were to take this apart a little bit, we might actually find that the way this query happened was talking to multiple services down below it. So like the storefront might come from an app running on localhost 4001, products came from 4002, manufacturers from 4003. And so in this way, we've got many services brought together into one combined gateway schema. And you can query this one gateway just invisibly and talk to many different locations. So that's kind of the overarching premise of what schema stitching or distributed architectures are trying to do. And there's a couple big tools that do this. One you've probably heard of is Apollo Federation. And schema stitching was kind of its precursor, really. So kind of a brief history here. Schema stitching was started in 2016 by Apollo, and it was somewhat famously deprecated in favor of their federation architecture. Still one of the top Google search results for schema stitching is the migration notes over to getting onto their newer federation system. And it sort of lived in infamy because it had a lot of hard-coded fixtures up in the gateway layer, lack of cross-service types, lots of bugs, numerous performance issues too. So those who've stitched, though, mostly remember it as this. So this would be a piece of code that's actually sitting up in the gateway where we're trying to go and make connections to lower subservices. And we've got this really gnarly resolver that's going and talking to a remote location, and it makes a mess very quickly. So what I'm here to tell you today is that you never have to write delegate to schema again unless you really want to. So this kind of old paradigm is gone. Why is that? That's because in 2020, the Guild took over the GraphQL Tools repo and really started bringing it back to life. This came at just such an opportune time for us at Vox Media. We were at a critical juncture on getting our GraphQL API scaled out, built up, and we were running an old prototype of old GraphQL tools. And instead of doing the prohibitively difficult at the time migration path up to federation, right when we needed it, all of a sudden new features started showing up inside of the technology that we were already using. And so started putting those together, and have been really pleased with some of the results that have came of it. So schema stitching in GraphQL Tools today under the Guild has all of the same old features that you have used before, if you're familiar with it. It still does subscriptions. It's got a large suite of schema transforms, so things like renaming types or object fields, filtering things out of schemas, extracting and hoisting, so taking a field from one spot and putting it into another spot. All these things are possible to go and set up your little sub-schemas, kind of groom them into the shape that you want them, and then you can plug them into your larger stitch service architecture. And then also custom extensions, just for going and writing a custom accessor that goes to a remote service someplace. So all this has always been there. The things that are really exciting and are new that came just really since April of last year, we got a really good strategy for cross-service types, merge types. Types from different services can be combined into one in the gateway schema. Automated query planning, so we can just talk to our gateway schema and it will figure out how to go and get all of the data that it needs from the different subservices. Batch execution is really interesting. It's a way of, if we're going to be making multiple requests to the same subservice, we might as well put all of those requests together into one aggregate query and send it as one operation down to the service. A full directives SDL, partial interfaces, where interfaces can actually be spread across services, computed fields, schema validations, and then there's all new documentation for a new generation of use. So this might sound a lot like just reinventing federation, but there are some distinct differences here. And this really kind of comes down to, stitching is a library that enhances GraphQL core with generic features that are similar to those of the federation framework. And so if we really want to kind of appreciate the differences between what stitching has to offer and what federation has to offer, it really kind of comes down to understanding those words of, what is a library and what is a framework. So just kind of taking them in turn here, start with federation. So we've kind of become used to seeing this sort of schema and just accept it as this is something that might appear in a subservice. And yet, if we actually start taking this apart, we've got some kind of nuances here. So things like the extends keyword is actually invalid GraphQL without having a local base type for it to extend. So that's actually really a superset of GraphQL and kind of part of this larger framework effort. Something like the weight field here, that's not actually part of the schema. It's a field that came from someplace else inside of our graph. It's actually a dependency of this shipping cost field. And so, federation is putting it in here for validation purposes, but, logistically speaking, it's not really part of this schema. And trying to query for it independently is inconsistent. And then also, where's the query for this? It's there. Federation builds it for you, but it's not necessarily obvious where that comes from. And so to contrast this with what stitching is doing, is stitching is first and foremost just saying, write plain GraphQL. So we've got a type, we've got an input that configures parameters for a type, and we've got a query that fetches a type. And then really all we need to do with directives is kind of just annotate this just plain vanilla GraphQL schema with, hey, these are some foreign keys that I need here, and then here's an accessor where to get one of these things. So our team really appreciates this about stitching, that it just uses this plain vanilla GraphQL pattern, while federation really expects engineers to be specialists with federation. And that's really lowered the bar of entry for members of our team who aren't necessarily experts with GraphQL, and then kind of asking them to be specialists with even more technology on top of that. So kind of just walking into some of the operations that schema stitching does in the new system. So we've got merged types in the new system. So we've got here two very innocent looking schemas. These would be subservices, the user schema, and then a post schema. If we wanted to put these two together, they would just merge together, same name, same type, inside of the gateway schema. And there is no extends keyword. There's no concept of one type going and overriding the other one. Whether a type has 1 or 100 fields, all services are equal. And then we can kind of just direct the assembly of the top level gateway schema with this canonical directive to say which definitions we really want inside of the gateway. This also lends itself to being very flexible. And this is something that's a bit different from federation, where everything is very rigid and locked. Stitching actually goes and encourages some level of flexibility. If we're trying to do something like a safe nullability transform, in the gateway, we can have a read-only field that is nullable proxy something that is not nullable behind it, or the inverse with inputs. Things like scalar types. There's no reason that an ID field inside of the gateway couldn't proxy a string underneath it. Read-only things like enums can be additive. And then interface subsets. This is really one of my favorite features, actually. This is a fairly involved explanation, so I'll defer you to this YouTube video here that I recorded a while back. Check out Stitching Cross-Service Interfaces, and it walks through the process of how an interface can actually be distributed across numerous subservices. And then we have the process of accessing types. So with schema stitching, we're really just using basic queries that were already there. So let's say we've got a request that comes in for the user type from the post schema. All we're really going to do is just go and grab its ID, send it to the opposing query in the other service, and say that we need the ID off this thing to go and pass to a reciprocal query. And then that can go and build our combined type inside of the gateway. And then this same thing works in reverse too, so we can go either direction. And this can get really complicated, actually. So we can extend this to a much larger scale. So in this case, we've got a price and a weight spread across two services that are needed by a third service, at which time there's no reason that the stitching plan can't go and collect fields from across services to go and get one unified type at the end. So at the end of all this, it really comes down to stitching really likes your queries, the queries that you are really writing for yourself to begin with. So, things like record gives you a single record, records gives you a list of records, find records by custom input. Any of these types of queries are all valid inputs to go and just be relating your types from different services together. And even entities, representations. Those familiar with Federation have seen this. This is the Federation protocol. Stitching is just a very generic consumer of types through some protocol. And even just talking to the entities endpoint is valid and possible to stitch types together. So then, lastly, something that's interesting here is that we build a gateway schema. And schema is sort of the key word here. So this is what stitching now looks like at the gateway level. That code sample that we saw at the beginning with that gnarly resolver has kind of just turned into this. Now we're collecting subschemas and we're putting them together. We can collect local schemas that we've built inside of the gateway server itself. We can collect remote schemas through our own protocols, through introspection. Doesn't matter how we get them. And we just declare those as being in stitched schema. And this is sort of the entire code footprint that we're putting up at the top. And then the really interesting one is that what that stitch schema variable comes out as. So stitching builds a schema, a standard GraphQL schema object. That means it can be queried as plain GraphQL. You can use it with any server. You can try it on the front end. We've heard people doing this. I've never tried it personally, but it sounds really interesting. This idea that your gateway is a schema is a lot different from the output of something like Federation, where the result is a server. You build a gateway server as opposed to a gateway schema. So let's do a quick demo here. I put together a few services and thought we could look at how we can bring schemas together with stitching. So I very intentionally set this thing up using a third-party API that I don't control. This here is the countries API, available at countries.trevorblades.com. And if we go and we look at what countries are, a country in this API is just a collection of metadata about the country itself. It has nothing really specific inside of it, just metadata. So if we were to query, we can get codes, names of the country, a little emoji showing its flag. I want to put this API with my own data, though. And so I went over to the UNESCO World Heritage site website and got a collection of World Heritage Site listings off of there. This is publicly available data, and each World Heritage Site that we have falls inside of a country. So this kind of lines up for going and aligning these types together. So if we look at what a UNESCO site is, UNESCO site has a bunch of information about the site itself. A site has a name, the date it was inducted as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, latitude, longitude, and it's also got this thing called a country, the type name country. And in this case, a country is a very small record. It really just has a listing of UNESCO sites that it owns, and then it has a foreign key, and a foreign key basically points to what this thing is referred to in another database. In this case, what it was going to be over in the countries API. So if we were to run this, this is hitting my local service directly, my subservice. And we can see I've got some information about a UNESCO site, lat long. I've got some countries. A country has this code, and then UNESCO site data. So then if we go over to the stitched gateway, this is where we actually go and put all these together. So I'm taking a service I don't own, a service that I do own, and using all of the queries that are just available between these two services, no special protocols, no nothing. And in this case, if we were to go and look at the country type, we've got a lot more methods available in here because we've literally just put these two APIs together. And you can see that in this case, our country has our UNESCO sites member on it, as well as all of the metadata that was available from the other service. So if we were to try to query for this, we can see that we've gotten UNESCO sites, lat, long, name, all from my local service here. We've gotten all of this country metadata from this third-party API running on a remote server someplace. And then we've gotten all of the UNESCO site data associated with that country, again, from my service, all together in one query, invisibly put together. And everything was just built using what was already available in terms of just the basic accessors that that API had and what I had in my service. Without getting too much into the code in the next 1 minute that we have on this presentation, you can check this out inside of the GraphQL Asia demo repo that I have under my name, GMAC, on GitHub. And just to finish up here, since there will probably be a question about it, I just thought I'd leave you with this. Federation and stitching are different systems solving similar problems. There's not necessarily a better answer or a right answer. It really comes down to what is appropriate for your team, what you're trying to do. And so what I leave you with here would be just what are the differences? If we were to distill it down, Federation is very much a framework. It is an opinionated framework. It builds you a server, which is going to distribute all of your data in one schema. And it has a very rich ecosystem of tools. By comparison, stitching is very much a library. It is very unopinionated. It builds a GraphQL schema, and then it is very self-managed. At Vox Media, we weren't necessarily looking to use the Apollo ecosystem of tools. So stitching was a fairly good fit for us, and we were able to innovate and build the architecture that we wanted using the tools that we had. Okay, so thank you very much. I'm GMAC on GitHub. I'm the author of the Schema Stitching Handbook, which has lots and lots of examples of how to go and set all of this up. I encourage you to read the docs at graphqltools.com to check out what's new. And then also the GraphQL Tools repo, please show some love to the real geniuses here, which are Yakov and Arda, who are the major authors and maintainers of the GraphQL Tools repo. They've done some amazing work in the past year, and lots more great stuff in the works. Thank you much. Bye.
Excellent talk, Greg. Thank you very much for that. If anybody has any questions, pop those in the chat right now. And I'm going to lead off with a quick question. Greg, you are the author of the Schema Stitching Handbook. What led you to decide not just to write a book about schema stitching to begin with, but what led you to decide to write a book?
Well, in the realm of technology, that's one of the challenges I've never taken on before. I also really like writing about technology. So yeah, we kind of ended up by default on schema stitching at work, and we had a lot of questions coming out of the community about how you did it, and especially with the tools evolving so quickly. And we're getting the same questions enough times over and over that I finally started kind of taking notes, consolidating them, and then it turned into a repo, and then it turned into a narrated code examples, and then it turned into a book.
So you just kind of worked your way into a book in that sense. That's a pretty cool way to do it.
And also sort of time box it to a month. I wanted to go and spend a month writing it, and we'll see how far we got in that time. So, and
cool.
It's in pretty good shape now.
That's a good way to write a book, I think, is you got to time box it. Otherwise it can turn into time plus infinity. Yeah. So very, very interesting. In regards to schema stitching, what has been the greatest challenges around that you've had, like from a work-related context?
It's just been going in, kind of getting up to speed with the tools as they've been maturing. So we were definitely trying to plan out a migration over to Federation, and it was just bigger than what our immediate time constraints allowed. And this tool was already kind of in our stack. And so, we started building on this new stuff, but it was still very, very primitive at the time. And so we actually engaged in the maintainers of GraphQL tools and kind of became maintainers ourselves and really started pushing it forward and growing the tools. And within 3 months or so, we had overcome a lot of the biggest challenges, but there's definitely some pain getting started.
Yeah, it's one of the great things about open source is being able to get into things, right into the inside of things, to get involved. So that's great. If there was a piece of advice for someone getting into GraphQL and schema stitching specifically, what would be your top advice for them in approaching it?
Probably that the entire system of stitching or federation, the distributed architecture really has a lot of merits. And, there's this talk really was about 2 different systems that are available. And I was focusing on the one that's sort of the underdog, and has gotten some love recently. But it really doesn't matter which one you use. I mean, it doesn't matter what the technology is, as long as you're kind of not afraid to go and try this thing, because the ability to go and split your GraphQL API into microservices and go and be consuming data on an app by app basis and then putting them all together in one, it really has just phenomenal merits and has done wonders for bringing our API to life into our customers.
Cool. Well, Greg, thank you so much for that talk. Appreciate it very much. Hope you have a great conference. We'll talk to you again sometime.
Thanks for having me.